In his book Looking Awry, Slavoj Žižek has this idea of analyzing mass culture using the most complicated theoretical concepts from psychoanalysis. The result is some extremely deep readings of films and books, stuff you'd never expect to sustain that level of analysis. And I thought, well, I'm something of a Žižek myself. Just kidding. I thought, what if I try to similarly overanalyze a franchise that I spent God knows how many hours playing, Fallout. In particular, I noticed that Fallout is really quite analyzable through some of the concepts from post-structuralism, which is a fancy name for the philosophical movement that is in no way uniform or has any single theory for analyzing anything, but it does have some interesting key figures that contributed to its foundations, and in my today's video I'm gonna try to introduce some of their concepts and see how those concepts can help us understand more about the world of Fallout. Namely, I'm going to focus on the theories by Michel Foucault, Jean Baudrillard, Jacques Derrida, and Roland Barthes, but I won't assume any knowledge of their writing on your part. I am going to assume that you have some familiarity with any of the games or the TV series, but that's also not going to be too crucial for understanding, as I'll be introducing the subject on the go. So let's get started with the topic that is perhaps the most important for the whole field of post-structuralism, ideology.
I already am eating from the trash can all the time. The name of this trash can is ideology.
An interesting approach to analyzing the presence of ideology in mass culture was proposed by Roland Barthes in his book Mythologies. In it, he was commenting on the concept of the sign devised by Ferdinand de Saussure. The sign, Saussure was saying, consists of two essential parts, a signifier and a signified. The signifier is the physical form of the sign, and the signified is what the signifier refers to. For example, let's take the word tree. The signifier here is the combination of sounds or characters that make up the word tree, and the signified is the idea of a tree that we imagine when we hear or read the word. Saussure's theory has a lot more to it, but that's the general idea we need for now. Now, Barthes was saying that this idea of a two-part sign is really a bit too simplistic, since it doesn't account for the meaning of the sign that may stand behind the literal meaning. He gives an example, the cover of a French magazine that depicts a young black boy in a French uniform giving a military salute. The signifier here is the picture itself as a physical object containing certain combinations of shapes and colors. The signified is the boy that is depicted, but is that it? Barthes says not even close. The actual meaning of the picture is creating a positive image of French imperialism. It's as if the picture is saying, look at this boy who's ready to sacrifice his life for the great French Empire. He is black, but for France that doesn't matter, as all French citizens are equal and can equally serve their motherland and feel proud about it. Barthes calls this underlying and hidden meaning of a sign a myth. He sees it as a kind of a superstructure that takes the original sign and adds some meaning on top of it, and very often that meaning has to do with ideology and power relations. Now, let's come back to our discussion of Fallout. Fallout is a very politicized game, so it's only natural that it's full of these signs that seem to mean one thing on the surface, but if you look closely, you can uncover their deeper ideological meaning. One of the first examples of that we can notice is the intro to Fallout 1, where we see a pre-war TV broadcast with someone wearing power armor in front of the American flag. This is surprisingly similar to what Barthes was talking about. This broadcast also highlights the imperialism of the USA, as if saying, again, that no matter who's wearing that power armor, they all serve their country equally well. They all are both patriotic and strong and ready to defend their country anytime, thus ensuring its safety no matter what comes in the future. Also ensuring Canada's safety by making it the 51st state. I've heard that somewhere already. But an interesting difference from the example that Barthes gave is that here the person wearing the power armor is completely anonymous. We don't know their gender, race, or even species. It might easily be a synth or some kind of AI controlling the armor. The ideological message of this anonymity is that first, anyone at all, including species unknown to mankind, can join the US Army and protect the country. And secondly, the US Army is going to crush its enemies, and the enemy is not even going to know who did it, thus delivering some very important ideological propaganda, both internally to US citizens or potential US citizens, and externally to the enemies of the United States. Another example of how we can use Barthes' methodology to analyze fallout is by looking at the iconography of the Vault Boy, which has become kind of a symbol of the whole franchise. The most famous variation of Vault Boy is the one where he stretches his arm and shows a thumbs up, which in the universe of Fallout has two meanings. First, it's the so-called rule of thumb, which is for measuring the safety from nuclear explosions, and secondly, it's the more universal gesture meaning okay, or some kind of positive response. It is this second meaning that I'm more interested in, since it tells us quite a bit about the pre-war United States and Vault-Tec. The hidden meaning behind the optimism of Vault Boy is that it serves as a reincarnation of the American dream in this new world of 2070s. Vault Boy is saying that if you work hard enough, you can afford a place in the vault for your family and be truly happy. This message is underlined almost explicitly in the poster of Fallout Shelter, where people are happy because they know they are moving into the vault, despite the fact that the bombs are about to drop. The optimism has a few interesting implications. Firstly, the optimism as such is a classic element of propaganda. For instance, the Soviet propaganda was all about an optimistic view of the future where everything will be fantastic. On the dark side, though, this optimism was used to prevent discussions of actual problems that existed in the republics, such as artificial famines, purges, etc. Similarly, the optimism of Vault-Tec serves to hide the actual cause why these vaults were even needed, namely the pro-war policy of both Vault-Tec and the US government. Secondly, the optimism of Vault Boy has a strictly capitalist ideological implication. It tries to underline how the only way to be happy in this new world is by giving your money to the big tech, and they'll take care of everything. It shifts the focus of how the country operates. Now it's no longer the state that's caring for its citizens, but tech companies that step in and start managing the population. And lastly, it creates a feeling of hopelessness about the future outside a vault by focusing on the inevitability of the war. Naturally, it is in Vault-Tec's interest to spread panic among the population and make people think it's absolutely necessary to buy a place in the vault. On one of the posters in Fallout 3, Vault-Tec cites its own analysts, saying that the odds of a worldwide nuclear Armageddon are extremely high, which means that you have to take care of your own future and pay them. This way you can see how the image of Vault Boy was very carefully designed to deliver some important ideological messages in favor of Vault-Tec. However, this kind of deeper meaning can also be found in places very remote from advertising and any sort of public communications. For instance, it can be found in architecture and city planning. One of my favorite examples of that is the casino Lucky 38 from Fallout New Vegas, the one where Mr. House resides. Lucky 38 is a very prominent building because it's visible from virtually any place on the map. Even in its remotest corners, you may still see the shape of its tower. But there's also the inverse effect. Anyone inside the tower can also see you at any time through its glass windows, and you would never know if you are being watched. This reminds me of the concept of the panopticon, first created by Jeremy Bentham in the 18th century and later analyzed in depth by Michel Foucault in his book Discipline and Punish. The panopticon is essentially a design of a prison where there is a tower with guards in the center and numerous prison cells in the circular building around the tower. The idea is that the guards can watch the prisoners anytime from inside their tower, and prisoners will never know when they are being watched, which means that they will think that they are being watched all the time. Of course, with Lucky 38 it's different, since the desert isn't really a prison and you can move around freely, but it still gives me the vibes of the same structure as the one Foucault was describing. It's as if the position of Lucky 38 symbolically shows the dominance of Mr. House across the whole of the Mojave Desert. What makes that impression even stronger is the appearance of Mr. House himself, who looks almost exactly like Orwell's Big Brother from the film adaptation of 1984. The main psychological trick that Big Brother plays on the citizens of Oceania is making them feel like they are constantly being watched and listened to. Even if they aren't, in fact, the psychological pressure will still make them docile citizens or simply docile bodies, using a term by Foucault himself. This way, Fallout New Vegas lets us know the actual power dynamic of the Mojave Desert, where Mr. House is at the very top, both literally and figuratively. So essentially, myth, according to Barthes, often elicits a certain emotional response that we feel, but not always understand rationally. And although it indeed often creates a shortcut to push ideological messages, that's not always the case. Sometimes the emotion itself is the end goal of a mass cultural product. That's when Roland Barthes' theory comes very close to the concept of kitsch, and Fallout kitsch is something that deserves a discussion of its own.
Welcome to Nuka World, America's favorite vacation destination. I'm Cappy.
Oh, and I'm Bottle.
And we're here to make sure you have FUN fun during your time at the park.
The concept of kitsch is explicitly described in the works by the philosopher Jean Baudrillard. He wrote that kitsch can be defined as a pseudo-object, or in other words, as a simulation, a copy, an imitation, a stereotype, as a dearth of real signification and a superabundance of science, as a glorification of the detail and a saturation by details. Kitsch as a pseudo-object reproducing some well-known part of reality is normally used as a cheap way to sell a certain emotion. For instance, a whole lot of AI slop nowadays is just images of cute animals that we emotionally tend to like. If we take this loose definition by Baudrillard, then Fallout's universe turns out to be full of kitsch. From the ubiquitous imitations of the 1950s American culture to posters such as this one with a space cat Mr. Pebbles, whose function as kitsch is very similar to that of contemporary AI slop. However, my favorite part of Fallout kitsch is how Fallout manages to turn the war and all its conventional attributes into kitsch. For instance, in Fallout 4 there is this ad for a game called Blast Radius, apparently intended to be played mainly by kids. Representing nuclear bombing in a kitsch-like way, this game seems to be making a fun object out of it by stripping away all the real signification of what nuclear bombing means. One other famous example is Nuka-Cola. Besides the obvious reference to Coca-Cola, it also adds on top a kitschy representation of war and its effects. The radiation that's an essential part of Nuka-Cola is possibly also what gives it its refreshing nature. And then the bottles of Nuka-Cola are themselves shaped like a rocket or a missile. This phenomenon reaches its most ridiculous point in Fallout 4's add-on Nuka World, which is about an amusement park built by Nuka-Cola Corporation with stuff like weaponized Nuka-Cola ammo that you shoot using a water pistol and that you can upgrade to create tiny nuclear explosions. This intermingling of war imagery in the mass culture of Fallout has a few implications. First, as I briefly mentioned when discussing Vault Boy, stuff like this does normalize the idea of living in a war-affected area, and by normalize, I mean that it makes you feel like it's not dangerous, like it's actually fun with all those flashy explosions and energetic radiation. From inside the game, the normalization of war is definitely part of pre-war Vault-Tec propaganda. It strives to spread the idea that war is just a small inconvenience that you can easily outlive inside a vault, so there is no reason to oppose war if it's waged for a good cause. This way it's part of the general capitalist theme we've discussed before. However, if we interpret Fallout as an artistic act inside our own world, then it also offers a rather distorted picture of war and violence in general. It feels like violence is represented as such a common part of the world that it no longer seems to evoke danger at all. Limbs and wounds get restored just as easily as they were damaged in the first place, and the existence of the perk Bloody Mess in all Fallout games is just one more proof of how ubiquitous violence is in the world of Fallout. The related theoretical concept here is something called an empty signifier, that is, a signifier that has lost the ability to refer to anything in particular due to its overuse. Violence in Fallout becomes just such an empty signifier that doesn't refer or mean anything real, it's just a byproduct of having fun. But it would be unfair to blame Fallout for such a depiction of violence and all that results from it. After all, it is just one notable example of a process that's been going on for decades. David Foster Wallace, for instance, was talking about the same thing in Quentin Tarantino's films. He wrote that an act of violence in an American film has, through repetition and desensitization, lost the ability to refer to anything but itself. Now, is that a bad thing? Maybe, but I'm not going to make any moral judgments out of it. For me personally, this overuse of violence that borders on kitsch feels quite fake and inauthentic, as if you're not really playing a post-nuclear game, but a post-nuclear game's parody of itself. Fallout, and especially Fallout 4, handles violence, war, radiation, weapons and whatnot so superficially that Fallout turns into a theme park of Fallout itself, and in that respect, Nuka World is really just a culmination of a process that's been developing in a franchise for the past decade or more. Fallout Kitsch has, however, one more interesting aspect. It's nostalgically focused on the pre-war past and the American 50s, and this nostalgia is something we should discuss in a bit more detail. Before we can talk about nostalgia in Fallout, we first gotta outline what is it that the world of Fallout feels nostalgic about. If we look close into the general premise of the franchise, we can see that its timeline is incredibly convoluted. It's essentially a chain of how one time frame represents another time frame. The writers of our own times, starting with 1997 when the first game came out, imagine and represent what the American 1950s were like, but they also imagine how the 1950s would imagine their own future, mainly represented by the year 2077 in the game. But through that imagined retro future of 2077, the writers imagine what an even more remote post-apocalyptic future would look like, ending up with the time frame of the actual franchise, which spans from 2161 in Fallout 1 to 2296 in the TV series. But then some games, and especially Fallout 4, make this chart a bit more simplistic. They forget the initial idea of retrofuturism as a representation of the future by the past and put too much focus on the past itself, be it the 1950s with the furniture and cars, 18th or 19th century with the Minutemen and airships, or even the Roman Empire with the Legion, resulting in a rather weird mumbo-jumbo of anything the writers could think of including in the game, which often feels comically fake, especially when you encounter a Minuteman ghoul quoting Abraham Lincoln in the 23rd century Boston.
Neighbors of the people, for the people. You feel me?
This is also the reason why the term retrofuturism, which is overused when discussing the world of Fallout, I personally find insufficient. It just doesn't capture the complexity of time references and representations in the franchise. I feel like a better theoretical concept to talk about Fallout is something called ontology, a term introduced by Jacques Derrida in his book Spectres of Marx. But to explain it, I first have to take a step back and expand on what we've discussed regarding Saussure's model of the sign. As I mentioned, Saussure saw the sign as a unity of two parts, the signifier and the signified. However, he also said that there are no positive meanings in language, there are only differences. Let me explain. Let's take our example of the word tree. Saussure would say that there is no essential meaning of what a tree is. We can only grasp the concept of a tree by understanding its semantic difference from other terms in language. For instance, to know what a signified tree means, we have to know what isn't a tree, that is, what a bush is, then what grass is, what wood is, etc. Only by knowing the meanings of all the other terms in the network of language can we get a good understanding of any given term. Now, Derrida agreed with that idea, but he said that the issue we are dealing here is deeper. Not only does the meaning consist of differences, but also meaning gets deferred from our understanding. In the case of the tree, any attempt at defining the concept of a tree would lead us into a rabbit hole of defining other terms, so we're never able to conceive of a pure idea of a tree, something that was imagined as quite possible at least since the times of Plato. Derrida coined the neat term difference to accommodate those two ideas of deferral and difference at the same time. Now, ontology is a rather similar concept to that of difference, but instead of applying it to language, ontology attempts to discuss the matters of culture and time. Ontology itself is another wordplay by Derrida that combines the words haunting and the term ontology, which is philosophical inquiry into what can be deemed to exist. Derrida posits that instead of defining any given phenomenon or event as presence, we should define it as an absence whose existence is deferred and haunted by ghosts of the past or an incomplete future. In other words, the identity of any given object is never contained purely within itself, but resides outside in the past and the future. Now, Fallout is perhaps one of the best examples of that. It is extremely nostalgic for the past in a way that the past starts to replace the present. All the airships, Minutemen, legions, radio posters that resemble American World War II propaganda, and all the things that we now consider retro replace the actual vision of the future that the franchise initially seemed to offer. Even the Brotherhood of Steel, which is supposedly the most advanced faction in the game, is almost exclusively focused on recovering technologies of the past. The concept of ontology seems to provide an explanation for that as well. Mark Fisher, one of the most interesting contributors to the subject, speaks of ontology in terms of 21st century music. He says that nowadays the idea of the future and music is essentially a remnant of the vision of the future from the past. Consider the fate of the concept of futuristic music. The futuristic in music has long since ceased to refer to any future that we expect to be different. It has become an established style, much like a particular typographical font. Invited to think of the futuristic, we will still come up with something like the music of Kraftwerk, even though this is now as antique as Glenn Miller's big band jazz was when the German group began experimenting with the synthesizers in the early 1970s. In other words, the cultural vision of the past essentially becomes a vision of the future. The future as a concept fixes itself in the past. I think this explains very well what is happening in the franchise of Fallout. Instead of creating some kind of original vision of what might be a post-apocalyptic future, Fallout instead becomes excessively fixated on the past, as if for the characters of the game the past is, in some way simultaneously, also the future. And that is because the past held humanity's most ambitious idea of what the future would be, and since that idea never came into reality because of the Great War, the only thing that remains is to mourn for the old world, hoping to restore it in some way. The feeling of mourning is quite essential here. Fisher says, haunting can be construed as a failed mourning. It's about refusing to give up the ghost. And that's what Fallout is all about. It's about mourning the failed future of the past, about attempting to revive the ghost of the old world. But as Fisher again says, not only has the future not arrived, it no longer seems possible. So the characters of Fallout seem to be wishing for a future that will simply never come. This sure does seem depressing, but is there hope as well in Fallout? Sure, and it has to do with humanity and Fallout's vision of how it can be transformed.
For over 100 years, we've dedicated ourselves to humanity's survival.
This brings us to the last topic I wanted to discuss, which is the vision of humanity that Fallout has, or at least tries to reflect upon. If we think about it, the whole world of Fallout is really about mankind in some extreme circumstances, but also mankind as imagined from the perspective of today. In that, Fallout is essentially making a statement about what makes us human and even doubting if our idea of humanity is sufficient. In almost every game of the franchise, we are faced with some extremely difficult questions regarding the limits of humanity, whether superhumans, ghouls or synths are essentially human-like in that they have free will and deserve their right to live freely. Here, post-structuralist theory proves useful again. Post-structuralism posits that nothing can enjoy a stable identity and a clear definition. Neither words nor events, not even human beings, can be described in an unambiguous way. The meaning of the word human is deferred from our understanding, since to understand it we have to in turn define other ambiguous words such as machine, animal, gender, etc., and those definitions, especially in a world like Fallout's, can be extremely difficult to make. One hint regarding why it is so might have been provided by the post-structuralist philosopher Judith Butler, especially in their writing about gender. In the article Performative Acts and Gender Constitution, they say that gender is in no way a stable identity or locus of agency from which various acts proceed. Rather, it is an identity tenuously constituted in time, an identity instituted through a stylized repetition of acts. In other words, gender isn't about who you are, but about what you do, about your way of behavior, or as they say, a stylized repetition of acts. In a patriarchal society, those gender roles have traditionally been stable and quite fixed. For example, men would be known for going to war or occupying important jobs, and women would be known for cooking food and caring for children. Butler says that those roles aren't something that you are naturally born with, but something constructed as you enter society and find out about its rules. Precisely because gender isn't an innate essence of human beings, but something that you learn to perform throughout your life, Butler says that gender essentially has a performative nature. The idea of performative gender itself is derived from the theory of speech acts by John Austin, who said that language isn't exclusively a way of imparting information, but also of doing things in real life. He coined the term performative utterance to denote those utterances that tend to do something in real life in addition to saying it. Austin gives an example, the phrase, "I named the ship the Queen Elizabeth." By saying it, you at the same time name the ship. Another example is, "I bet you sixpence it will rain tomorrow," where the act of betting is performed purely by saying the phrase. Or, as in the case of Butler, saying certain things in language also automatically confirms your own position in society, including your gender role. Now, you might have already guessed where this is going. If gender isn't really an ontological category, that is, if it's not something inherent to the human being, then can we apply the same ideas to the definition of the human being itself? This is where Fallout finally has a say. Yes, you can. Maybe. Fallout is an open-world game, so it doesn't give you any specific answers, but it sure does make us doubt whether the human being as such is a stable category that means one thing and one thing only. In all Fallout games, we get to face difficult choices regarding who to consider as a human being or someone equal to a human being. Ghouls, super mutants, robots and synths all fall into that problematic category. Ghouls and super mutants are, however, a bit of a simpler case since they were humans in the past, but turned into something else either due to radiation exposure or due to getting thrown into a pot of pea soup. Synths, on the other hand, are a different case since they aren't even organic beings and it's a lot harder to sympathize with a robot. Because of that radical difference from humans, robots or synths are the most interesting for exploring Fallout's vision of humanity. We can break down that vision into two predominant points of view, in Fallout 4 represented by the Institute and the Railroad. The Institute has the more traditional view that human beings have a certain intrinsic essence that sets them apart from the robots. The Railroad, on the other hand, has the view that the search for the human essence is futile and what we should do instead is focus on what someone does rather than on what someone is. Similar to the theory by Butler, they value performativity over ontology. One other person who had similar views was Alan Turing. In his famous imitation game, a human evaluator is supposed to tell a machine apart from a human being just by interacting with them via a text interface. If the machine's responses are indistinguishable from humans, that is, if the machine can perform humanness, then the machine can be considered equal to the human in intelligence. However, one aspect of Turing's test that is often overlooked is that his test also consisted of another experiment, where the human evaluator was supposed to communicate with two beings, one of them a machine, and figure out which is male and which is female. If the machine managed to imitate the gender role of the other human being and confuse the evaluator as to who is who, then that machine were to be considered to have human-like intelligence. Now, for Turing, this gender differentiation aspect was just as important as a pure human-machine differentiation test, and this is where Butler's theory comes in handy again. What Turing seems to be saying is that it is as important for a machine to learn to imitate the gender roles of human beings as anything else. Our ability to perform gender is one of the main characteristics that define us as human. And the world of Fallout is aware of the gender implications regarding human-like machines. For instance, in Good Neighbor, in Fallout 4, there's this robot named Cleo who's performing the female gender role. One of the dialogue options is to act surprised, and that's no wonder. If you believe that gender is somehow inherent to the human nature and body, then Cleo's femininity just doesn't make sense. She is, after all, a robot and doesn't have any female biological features. But if we stick to the ideas that Butler expresses in her works, then we won't see any particular difference between Cleo and any other human being, since both of them are essentially performing their gender roles in an attempt to appear human. But then, is it right to call such edge cases of performative humanity actual humans? Probably not. Our language imposes on us a certain understanding of words, and that understanding is nearly impossible to change since it's fixed in language itself and in collective minds of humanity. Perhaps a better way to talk about such problematic cases is by inventing a new term, and thankfully that term already exists in a field of study called posthumanism. Catherine Hales, one of the key researchers in the field, says that posthumanity is characterized by a process where information loses its body. What she means is that with the rise of digital technologies, information is no longer set in stone in a specific medium. Instead, it can float from medium to medium without losing its essence. Let's take the example of the most classical information medium, a book. Before digital technologies, a book would contain its information in a very fixed form, that is, in print. However, with digital books, information is no longer embodied in the specific medium of a book, and instead consists of highly abstract binary code that can be temporarily projected onto any medium such as a phone, a laptop, a tablet, etc. But Hales argues that it's not just about things around us, it first and foremost concerns us humans. We're also sort of a medium holding information, be it genes, memories or skills. All of it can be thought of as information that our bodies carry, and since information is no longer necessarily embodied, the human body becomes more like a redundant part of human beings that serves to carry our information but can be replaced by any other medium if needed. Hales says this disembodiment is the main characteristic of the new mode of existence that she calls posthumanity. Then if we go back to the topic of Fallout, then we'll see that the franchise is heavily informed by the ideas of post-humanity. Even if not directly, then still most of the weird things happening in Fallout can be explained in terms of the theory of post-humanism. The synths, for example, are a perfect example of a post-human. Physically, their bodies are robotic, but since physical embodiment no longer matters, we may still perceive them as normal post-human beings because their essential part is the information they carry inside them, and from the outside they look just the same as normal humans, made of flesh and bone. They themselves may not even realize that they are synths, as it often happens in Fallout 4, but it also doesn't really matter because in the world of post-humanity that difference isn't essential. As Hale says, in the post-human there are no essential differences or absolute demarcations between bodily existence and computer simulation, cybernetic mechanism and biological organism, robot teleology and human goals. And Fallout does a decent job at showing us this new post-human reality that is certainly becoming more and more relevant in our own world.